England, the land of ancient bloodlines and royal dynasties, was once a beacon of stability in medieval Europe, but beneath the surface of this mighty kingdom, a storm was brewing. A storm that would erupt into one of the most infamous conflicts in English history, the Wars of the Roses. The roots of this bitter conflict stretch back generations to the very heart of the Plantagenet dynasty. The seeds of discord were sown in 1377 with the death of King Edward III, a monarch whose numerous sons would become the progenitors of rival claims to the English throne. Among them were the Houses of Lancaster and York,
two branches of the same royal family,
whose rivalry would plunge England into this decades-long civil war. Under the rule of Henry V, the Lancastrian branch of the Plantagenets enjoyed a period of stability and glory. Henry's military triumphs, including his legendary victory at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, secured his place in history as one of England's greatest kings. But his early death in 1422 left the kingdom in the hands of his infant son, Henry VI, who would grow into a king ill-suited to the demands of rule. Henry VI ascended to the throne at 9 months old, and from the outset his reign was marked by challenges. The crown didn't fit, he couldn't talk, and he couldn't ride a horse to battle, unlike his warrior father. Henry was gentle and pious, but also prone to bouts of mental instability. What this instability is still hotly debated, and his inability to assert control over the nobility and the loss of English territories in France during the 100 Years' War further weakened his position, creating a power vacuum at the heart of the kingdom. With the king's authority in question, England's great nobles began to vie for influence, and none were more ambitious than Richard Plantagenet, the Duke of York. A direct descendant of Edward III, Richard harboured his own aspirations for the throne, and his discontent with the Lancastrian court only grew as England's fortunes declined. By 1453, England was in crisis. Henry VI's mental state had deteriorated, leaving him incapable of ruling. Richard Plantagenet, once a loyal servant to the crown, was appointed the Lord Protector, an astonishing rise for a man who, only 2 years earlier, had taken up arms against the king in a failed attempt to remove Edmund Beaufort, the Duke of Somerset, from his position of command. But as Richard consolidated his power, an unexpected development complicated matters. Henry's wife, Margaret of Anjou, announced she was pregnant, and in 1453 she gave birth to a son, Edward of Westminster, shoring up the Lancastrian line of succession. Margaret, fiercely protective of her son's rights, became the driving force behind the Lancastrian force. In 1455, Henry VI had recovered enough to resume his rule. Influenced by his court, and particularly by the very man that Richard sought to oust, Edmund Beaufort, the Duke of Somerset, this return to power came at the cost of Richard, who was once again sidelined. Faced with exclusion and fearing for his safety, Richard raised an army on May 22, 1455, and the first battle of the Wars of the Roses erupted in St Albans. The Battle of St Albans was relatively small in scale, marked the beginning of conflict that would engulf England for decades. Richard's forces were victorious, and the key Lancastrian leaders, including Beaufort, were killed. In the aftermath, a mentally unstable Henry VI was found abandoned by his advisors, leading Richard's reappointment as Lord Protector. For a brief moment, England settled into a state of uneasy truce. The two sides, Lancaster and York, attempted to reconcile, but the underlying issue remained unresolved. The question of succession. Who would the crown pass to? Richard, Duke of York, or the young Edward of Westminster, the son of Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou? Margaret would not allow her son to be disinherited. She bided her time, waiting for the right moment to strike, and in February 1456, when Henry VI recovered once more, Richard was relieved of his duties as protector. Margaret, fearing for her son's future, moved the royal court to Coventry, of all places. Margaret's influence grew as she worked to isolate Richard, reassigning key positions of men loyal to her son. Richard was sent to Ireland, removed from the centre of power. But the peace Margaret hoped to secure was fleeting. The rivalry between Lancaster and York had become too deep, too bitter to be resolved through diplomacy. In 1458, in a symbolic gesture of unity, the Loveday procession was organised, with the warring factions walking hand in hand to St Paul's Cathedral. This can be accurately measured through its impact, which was exactly none. Nothing changed. It was merely a day out for all on the king's dime. Even as the two sides feigned peace, new provocations emerged. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, and a staunch ally of York, provoked the ire of the Hanseatic League and Spain through his piracy in the Channel. a popular play with the merchants of London. When summoned to the capital to explain his actions, the Kingmaker claimed he was the target of assassination after a brawl broke out between his household and the royal household guards, fleeing back to Calais and further straining relations with the Lancastrian court. By 1459, tensions reached boiling point. Richard of York, the Kingmaker, and the Earl of Salisbury, now in a formal alliance, refused to attend the Grand Council in Coventry, suspecting it was a trap to arrest them. Instead, they gathered their forces at Ludlow Castle,
preparing for an inevitable confrontation. They marched to Worcester and sent their protestations to the king, claiming they wanted to remove the bad apples of government.
Henry ignored them and marched on as the nominal head for the royal army. The Yorkists retreated back to Ludlow to make their last stand. Despite their preparations, the Yorkists were outnumbered and outmanoeuvred, and on the eve of battle, pardons were offered, and the Kingmaker's men defected to the Lancastrian side, forcing the Yorkist leaders to flee into the night. With their forces surrounded, the Yorkist cause seemed lost, and the Lancastrians tightened their grip on the kingdom, further stacking the court with Lancastrian favourites, which only aided claims of corruption in the court to the wider populace, while little being done to prevent lawlessness. With York and his supporters declared traitors of the Parliament of Devils in 1459, the conflict entered a new and more dangerous phase. Stripped of their titles and lands, the Yorkists had been pushed to the brink, but they had nothing left to lose. In June 1460, the Yorkists struck back. Richard's allies, led by the Kingmaker, sailed from Calais and invaded England, seizing London with the support of its citizens. With the buff of the Pope's blessing, they marched north, where they met Henry VI's forces in the Battle of Northampton. The Yorkists were victorious, aided by treachery with the Lancastrian ranks, with an entire left flank commanded by Lord Grey of Ruthin joining them should the Yorkists help him in a minor dispute over land and potential high office. With Henry VI once again in their custody, York returned to London, this time with a bolder claim. He sought the throne himself. At the state opening of Parliament, York dramatically advanced his claim to the throne, citing descent from Edward III through the Duke of Clarence. But his allies were hesitant. They sought not to overthrow the king, but to reform the governments of the realm. After much debate, the Act of Accord was passed in October 1460. York was recognised as the rightful heir of the throne, disinheriting Henry's son, Edward. The compromise was intended to bring peace, but it only fueled Margaret of Anjou's fury. After the Battle of Northampton, she had fled to North Wales and then into Scotland to rally support to her cause. In exchange for small border concessions, she bought herself and her son an army to retake England. On December 30th, 1460, York met Margaret's forces at the Battle of Wakefield. Deception once again played a pivotal role in the outcome of the battle, with the Lancastrians deploying several tactics involving offers of defection, disguise and deception. York was slain on the battlefield along with his son Edmund, the Earl of Salisbury. The Duke of York's head was mounted on a spike at the gates of York and adorned with a paper crown, a grim reminder of the bloody struggle for power that now consumed England. The death of York at the Battle of Wakefield sent shockwaves through England. The Yorkist cause, however, did not die with him. York's eldest son, Edward, now the Duke of York, emerged the new leader of the faction, determined to avenge his father's death and claim the throne. Edward, at just 18 years old, was a striking and charismatic leader, known for his military prowess and strategic acumen. In 1461, he took command of his father's armies and continued the fight to claim the throne. Edward's resolve was soon tested at the Battle of Mortimer's Cross. The battle was short and decisive, the Yorkist forces triumphed, and Edward's leadership was solidified. With this victory, Edward began his march towards London, where he would confront the Lancastrian forces under the command of Margaret of Anjou. Before Edward could reach London, the Second Battle of St Albans took place in February 1461. Warwick's army, who were defending London, were taken by surprise and King Henry VI was released from captivity, dealing a blow to the Yorkist cause. But Edward would not be deterred. The decisive clash came at the Battle of Towton on March 29, 1461, one of the largest and bloodiest battles ever fought on English soil, with as many as 65,000 men on the field. As snow and wind battered the soldiers, the Yorkists deployed their archers with the wind at their back, allowing for greater range, and wreaking havoc into the Lancastrian lines with a single volley. And from there, the Yorkist army continued to outplay the Lancastrian forces, forcing them into advancing into more accurate range of the Yorkist arrows, which either found home in the flesh of the enemy, or stood upright in their path. Edward displayed incredible battlefield prowess, taking command of the left flank after a surprise attack sent it into disarray. His example on the battlefield inspired those around him and showcased his leadership. Despite this, it was only when Norfolk's men arrived on the field that a conclusive victor began to emerge. His attack on the Lancastrian men secured victory for the young York. The battle was a massacre, with thousands of men cut down in the freezing mud and snow. Towton was a catastrophe for the Lancastrian cause. Henry, Margaret and Edward fled to Scotland, where Margaret and Edward sailed to the continent to gather support from France, while Henry VI remained in Scotland. Edward of York was crowned Edward IV of England and began his rule. Later, in 1463, the Queen Mother to King James III of Scotland,
who had been pivotal
to the support of Henry, died, and so Scotland sued for peace with Edward. Henry once more sought refuge, heading back into England, now a fugitive. Following the defeat of the last Lancastrian loyalists at Hexham, Henry was captured and imprisoned in the Tower of London. Edward seemed poised to usher in a new era of stability, but not for long. Edward decided on a secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner and widow of a Lancastrian knight. This shocked the court and alienated many of his closest allies, none more so than the Kingmaker himself. The Kingmaker, once the king's greatest supporter, felt betrayed. He had hoped to marry Edward to a French princess to secure a powerful alliance, but Edward's impulsive marriage to Elizabeth Woodville thwarted those plans. Angered by his diminished influence, the Kingmaker began to plot Edward's downfall. In a dramatic turn of events, Warwick allied himself with Edward's own brother, George, Duke of Clarence, who harboured ambitions of his own. Together, they raised an army against Edward IV, plunging England back into civil war. In 1469, the Kingmaker and Clarence defeated Edward's forces at the Battle of Edgecote, capturing the king and briefly taking control of government. However, their coup was short-lived, lacking support, and Edward, a master of political manoeuvring, was released and resumed the throne. The plot had been for nothing, and the Kingmaker and Clarence had outed themselves as treacherous. The Kingmaker was invited by Louis XI to join the cause of Margaret and Henry, and in 1470,
the Kingmaker landed back on English soil to restore the king he himself had dethroned 9 years prior.
Edward fled the country, and Henry sat at the throne once more. Edward IV's resilience, however, was on full display in 1471. He returned from exile in Burgundy, landing on the British coast and rapidly gathering support. In April, he met Warwick's forces at the Battle of Barnet. The battle was hard fought, with fog causing chaos, with men on the same side fighting one another, but ultimately Edward emerged victorious, and the Kingmaker, one of the greatest characters of the entire war, was killed on the field. Weeks later, the Lancastrians, now led by a teenage Edward of Westminster, faced Edward IV's army at the Battle of Tewkesbury. In a brutal and decisive engagement, the Lancastrian forces were crushed, and Edward of Westminster was slain. And, with the death of Henry VI, likely murdered in the Tower of London soon after, the male line of the Lancastrians was cut down. Edward IV ruled for another 12 years, bringing a relative peace and prosperity to England. Yet his reign was not without challenges. His latter years were marked by internal dissent and lingering unrest, particularly over his controversial favouritism towards the Woodville family, which alienated many nobles. In April 1483, Edward IV died suddenly, from reasons not quite known, leaving his 12-year-old son, Edward V, as heir. The young king's reign, however, would be tragically brief. Edward IV's brother, Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, was appointed Lord Protector of the young king. But Gloucester had his own ambitions, and he swiftly moved to consolidate power, imprisoning Edward V and his brother in the Tower of London. The fate of the young princes remains one of the most enduring mysteries of English history, and by the summer of 1483, they had vanished from the Tower, and Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, had seized the throne, declaring himself King Richard III. Richard III's reign was troubled from the start. His usurpation of the throne alienated many former allies, and rumours of the fate of the princes dogged his reputation. Yet Richard was an able ruler, attempting reforms and seeking to stabilise the realm. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, the Lancastrian cause was revived by an unlikely figure, Henry Tudor, a distant relative of the Lancastrian kings, who had been living in exile in Brittany. With Richard III's hold on the throne weakening, Henry saw his chance to strike. Henry Tudor gathered support from both disillusioned Yorkists and loyal Lancastrians, promising to unite the warring factions and bring peace to England. Hurrah! In August 1485, Henry landed in Wales with a small army, marching to confront Richard III in what would be the final battle of the Wars of the Roses. On August the 22nd, 1485, the two armies met at Bosworth Field. The battle that followed would determine the fate of the English crown. Henry, knowing he was inexperienced in command, handed over the reins to Oxford. Knowing that they were outnumbered, Oxford opted for a tight formation of battle, with no man to stray further than 10 foot from the banners. There would be no vanguard, or battles. All would march as one, with the cavalry securing the flanks. Richard's cannon tore through the mass as they advanced clear of the marsh and began to engage. Richard's army was at a disadvantage and signalled for Northumberland to join the fray, but he didn't, either for personal reasons or the field didn't allow it. During the battle, Richard spots Henry on the field and decides to end this war by killing its leader. He personally led his finest knights in a charge that so surprised Henry's guard that Richard was able to kill several in quick succession. Henry chose not to engage in direct combat and allowed those to fight around him. Richard's force was unable to reach Henry and was forced back until they reached the marsh, where, surrounded and outnumbered, Richard's horse fell and he was promptly killed. His body was mutilated and displayed for all to see, ending up underneath a car park in Leicester. He was the last English king to die in combat. With Richard III's death, the War of the Roses came to an end. Henry Tudor, the final claimant to the throne, was crowned King Henry VII. In a symbolic gesture to unite the houses of Lancaster and York, he married Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's daughter. Henry VII's marriage to Elizabeth of York united the feuding houses,
symbolised by the creation of the Tudor rose,
a blend of the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York. His reign marked the end of the decades of civil war and ushering a new era of peace and prosperity to England. Hi, I'm Matt, and this is Salopian Historian, a channel about history, where I will be diving into any area of history I fancy and explore our past in simple, easy to understand videos. Subscribe to follow along.